There was no redemption arc for Capcom. I do think I need to start off this video saying that because there seems to be this really big narrative regarding gaming YouTubers over the past decade that at some point Capcom was bad in the mid 2000s, but then all of a sudden, like magic, they became good. They had their redemption arc, and they've been hitting out nothing but bangers ever since then. Now, this is nothing but like a forced meme by the marketers at Capcom, right? It has no real basis in reality. There was no redemption arc. They put out nothing good on Nintendo consoles to justify that kind of response. Like all they did was release Devil May Cry 5, and really that's about it. Like what are you talking about when you say a Capcom redemption arc? Like Resident Evil 7? Come on. That game is like 3 hours long and is slow and boring. Resident Evil 8? No. The remakes? No. Like Street Fighter 6? No. Devil May Cry 5? No. Of course not. That microtransaction laden mess, right? And now with Dragon's Dogma 2, it's happening all over again. Capcom is the best. Oh, like I know I don't play any other games from any other developers, especially not from Nintendo, but Dragon's Dogma 2 is one of the best open world fantasy games I've ever played. Oh man, I know I didn't play Tears of the Kingdom, but oh man, I know Dragon's Dogma 2 is better than it, right? That's the cope we've been seeing over the past couple of days, right? Is that people are ignoring all the very real, blatant, obvious problems with Dragon Dogma 2 in order to push this narrative that Capcom produces good video games. Because we know that all of these people are in Capcom's pocket. Max Dude, Susie Hunter, all of these men are just sitting here like, oh, how deep do you want me to like suck your cock, Capcom? Like how deep do you want it? Like I can go all the way down if you want. Like that is how these people behave, right? And it's not just for Capcom. We're seeing similar things happen to Final Fantasy VII Rebirth. But like when you look at what happens with Capcom specifically, like it's disgusting how these e-celebs tried to create a narrative out of whole cloth that Capcom had a redemption arc from their low period, right? Where everybody hated everything they did. Whether it was like the Bionic Camp Commando thing, where like, oh, the wife was your arm the entire time, stuff like Devil May Cry 4 and like going back the entire game as Dante for the second half, uh, like you have all this stuff that like everybody hated at the time. But even back then, people were working overtime, like trying to damage control for Capcom. Like, oh, they need to adjust. They need to change things around. I've heard people say recently that the reason Resident Evil fell off the way it did, like after Code Veronica, was because Nintendo signed an exclusivity contract with them and they weren't able to make the games they wanted to make. Resident Evil Remake and 4, both of which were Nintendo exclusive. Oh, and Zero, the best games in the franchise for a lot of people. Like, oh, those killed those killed the survival horror genre because they were on the wrong platform. Right? I've heard some delusional takes, but that takes the take. That was just sheer, just audacious, just nonsense, right? Like on the wrong platform, are you kidding? And you've seen like similar things recently with like Monster Hunter, right? Where like the audience, these kind of YouTube shills, like they try to convince you that like Rise is like a spin-off game and like World is the real one because it's on the real platforms, but in reality, like Rise did perfectly well for itself, right? Like the narrative that like Rise had something like terribly wrong with it was incorrect, right? But you won't see these people acknowledge that, it's just they'll just continue delusionally trying to convince you that like, oh, Wilds is gonna fix all the problems Rise has because it's not locked to Nintendo hardware. It's just okay, keep trying to convince yourself that, buddy. It's just it's absurd, right? Like we've seen this all the time, but there's this obsessive hate, like obsessive need from the community to downplay everything that comes out on Nintendo consoles. Stuff like Unicorn Overlord, stuff like Princess Peach Showtime, while hyping up everything else on the other platforms. Rise of the Ronin, uh, Dragon's Dogma 2, Baldur's Gate 3, like uh Devil May Cry 5, all these like lesser experiences that like honestly wouldn't even be worth your time playing if you had like actually owned a Nintendo Switch and actually played the superior alternatives, right? Like if you go from Bayonetta 3 and then go to Devil May Cry 5, you're gonna find it slow and boring, like I did, right? Like it's just impossible to compare the two because Bayonetta 3 is just so much better. Like Bayonetta 1 is so much better. That's how bad it is. Even Bayonetta 2, which I hate, by the way, is still better than like every Devil May Cry game, right? Like the difference in quality between like uh, these developers is insane. And then these guys are gonna do like I've seen people like, oh, the Bayonetta team could never make a good Devil May Cry game. They couldn't make a Devil May Cry game as good as the original. Like it's just like, okay, guys, come on. They made the original. Okay. It's straight up delusional, right? Like people do not understand. People do not want to admit that Capcom has not been good in a long time. I would argue since like the 90s. Okay, they used to put out pretty good stuff. They used to be pretty solid. Like, and there's been like some major hits since then. I love God Hand, RE4, um, Beautiful Joe, Mega Man Battle Network. There are things that Capcom has done that's good, right? There's no denying that. Like, nobody's going to take that away from you. But at the same time, like, you have to acknowledge that the company as a whole, much like Square Enix, is a complete mess, right? They're producing nothing good. This idea that they're in like the golden period of their existence, that they're putting out like banger after banger, is just completely out of touch with reality, right? Like Capcom is not succeeding in any way, shape, or form. People need to acknowledge that something like Dragon's Dogma 2, this microtransaction, low frame rate, like broken, unfinished mess, like this is, although the game journalists don't want to admit it, a bad video game, right? And right now, because this is the only game that's come out recently, like everybody's trying to like say it's like the greatest ever, but like how long is that gonna last? Like realistically, like they tried saying the same thing about Baldur's Gate 3, and look where that went. Absolutely nowhere. Hasbro and Larian has cut ties. They've confirmed they're not going to be producing another one, right? Because the game was such a failure, right? Capcom is in a similar position, I feel like, where they have like a very dedicated, devoted following of people who like obsessively praise everything they do, but that isn't the same as having real success. Is kind of like my feeling on this. Like Capcom is going to continue to struggle for the in the very near future because are their video games are simply not that competitive.